Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to be with you and to share with you today. Before we begin, please join me in a round of applause. Hit your applause buttons, your likes, your love buttons for Allison, for all she does for others, and for our other panel guests who have been incredible, incredibly impressive so far. You can see that I'm going third. That shows you what happens when you show up late to the who goes first meeting. So. No, all kidding aside, I'm thrilled to be here today to share with you my perspective on empowering veterans through their leadership capabilities. And what I'd like to share is something both personal and professional, a personal path and a professional path that I've experienced, and a path that I believe can help build resilience within our veteran community by capturing, communicating, and credentialing their leadership capabilities. Again, thank you very, very much for allowing me to share today. And as an executive coach and facilitator of lead-based leadership certification, leadership development course I developed, I always start with three things: a story, an exercise, and a question. We won't do the exercise or the activity today. There's plenty of time for that later when we go through certification later. But let me begin with a story. And what I'll do is I'd like to start with a there I was story. There I was, retiring after 27 years in the Air Force. And what I've got before you now is just a kind of a collage, if you will, that represents, I had an honor of serving in two distinct careers. First, as an enlisted weapons director, and then as a senior NCO, and then later as an intelligence weapons officer, going to the Air Force Weapons School for America's Air Operations Center. I stood watch with fighters, as a controller on alert over our homeland in the NORAD enterprise. I developed warfighters at the Command and Control Warrior Advanced course. I graduated from weapons school. I was named one of the 12 Outstanding Airmen of the Year. And in short, I say all those things to say that, I had the opportunity to learn and operate at the intersection of no-fail missions and true leadership development. I learned how to simplify complexity and lead with purpose. But when it came time to take off the uniform, it just seemed like I realized something that many other veterans come to understand is that there's no civilian job title that matched my qualifications. I wasn't a project management professional. I wasn't an accountant. I wasn't a cyber expert. Yet I had led in high stakes operations and learned from some of the greatest leaders operating under extreme pressure with everything on the line. And still, that leadership doesn't resonate on a resume. It doesn't seem to translate. And that hits hard. You don't need validation, but you do need translation. So you come face to face with a gap that what we know as veterans, it's just not recognized in the civilian sector. And we tried multiple different things. Despite all you've done in leading teams or managing threat warnings or earning elite credentials, none of it seems to carry weight outside the military without some type of civilian certification. So, you kind of lose some of your professional identity, being humble, approachable, credible. Of course, you're always those things, but it just doesn't seem to matter, as much as it does when you're in the military. So I can't really say that I set out to fix it, but I couldn't teach anymore. I love teaching. I've always been a student of leadership studies, and I like to joke and say, yes, I think my wife slipped crazy pills into my vitamin bottle because next thing I know, never say never. I had sworn off school and that I was done, but next thing I know, I decided to go back to school. And in December of 2021, I earned my doctorate of executive leadership from the University of Charleston School of Business and Leadership. And from that journey, during my qualitative research on executive leadership that encompassed approximately 100 years of experience during natural disasters, came the concept of developing a leads-based leadership perspective. And now that leads-based leadership has been lifting up active duty service members, college students, and executives utilizing leads-based leadership perspective for their teams, why not use it to lift up our veterans? In focusing on leadership development as another layer of building whichever pillar you want to put it into, a social pillar of, the comprehensive airman fitness plan, right? Our resiliency plan, the physical, the mental, the spiritual. So the social, so in developing your personal and professional leadership development, I feel like it'll be a way to capture the leadership the veterans already live and breathe and give the professional weight that it deserves. You're not starting from scratch with veterans. We're communicating what veterans are great at, leadership from the field or from the flight line or from the fight, and give them a way to speak that language in the civilian world. It's about being able to communicate and being gainfully employed and making a difference again. So I just feel like, when we train together, we thrive together. We've all felt that. And to I believe that veterans need support in identifying their gifts of leadership. I've often said that, many think of going kinetic, like warheads on foreheads, right, from experience of either working within the weapon system or, by employing weapons in the military. Yet you think about those weapons as just hardware. Your leadership is the real weapon, and being kinetic, putting your energy and motion to lead, is directing your energy at discovering a lead space awareness perspective. So, because I feel like lead space leadership can translate. It can translate experience into professional recognition, helping veterans to be seen, valued, and certified. It affirms what veterans already have, the ability to lead with clarity and confidence and credibility. I'm here because I want to partner with people and programs like America's Warrior Partnership that believe in lifting up our veterans and increasing their value proposition, to put the right tools in their hands and give them their next mission and help them, as with me, feel gainfully employed and making a difference again. That to me is how leadership development can be thought of. It's building resiliency in veterans and veteran integration into different corporations. So, so I said I started with a story that's just kind of my personal story, if you will. Um, but what makes lead space leadership so important? For the question piece, during the 2025 back in April, our National Hurricane Conference in New Orleans, we asked hundreds, how do you know? It's a three-part question. How do you know? Not the rest of the world, not your spouse, not your boss, not your peers. How do you know? That's the first part. That you're the most effective you could possibly be. That's the second part. The most effective you could possibly be. You're doing everything to be the most effective. Third part, as a, okay, now fill in the blank. When you fill in the blank with pilot or controller or accountant, you answer easily. There's initial qualification training or mission continuation training. Fill in that blank with leader. How do you know you're the most effective leader you could possibly be? And one thing becomes clear is that somebody to actually have to define one's true leadership impact is not always easy. Yet when you discover your lead space leadership, you will always and forever be able to answer that question. Now, I'm happy to report as a service disabled veteran owned small business that lead space leadership certification is recognized by the University of Charleston School of Leadership, as well as the West Virginia, Louisiana, and I've got here on the slide the Florida State Bar Associations for continuing legal education credit. So it's getting a lot of recognition out there, and the more and more that we get veterans certified, and this is what you get upon completion. It's a certification, it's a declaration that you've demonstrated the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you can thrive in complexity environments, that you know how to think critically, make domain-aware decisions, and solve problems with your team, while you're co-producing effective outcomes. That's Tiffany. She was one of the first one in the new curriculum to get certified. And with that, I'd like to, you know, thank Allison again for all she does for others and allowing me to share my personal path, and transition from the military and how that kind of feels to feel like you're losing your identity. Like no matter how good you were, it doesn't matter, if you can't point to it on a piece of paper. So again, thanks for listening, and Allison, thanks for all you do for others.